I found out my dad wasn't who I thought he was, and it changed everything. It was just a normal weekend. I was hanging out with my dad, just like we always did. He'd been my rock growing up, my hero, the guy I turned to for advice. But that Saturday afternoon, something happened that shattered everything I thought I knew about him. It all started with a phone call. Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had just finished helping my dad with some gardening in the backyard. We didn't always spend this much time together, but it was one of those rare weekends when we had nothing on our schedules. He was a simple guy, always hardworking, always there when you needed him, and always full of advice. He had this calm, steady energy about him that made you feel like everything would be okay no matter what. We were sitting on the porch, the sun just starting to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over everything. It was the perfect moment for an easy conversation. We talked about my work, life in general, the usual stuff. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then his phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, and for some reason I immediately noticed the change in his face when he saw it. His demeanor shifted ever so slightly. He quickly glanced at me before answering, but there was something about his expression that made me feel uneasy. "Hello," he said, his voice steady but a little tighter than usual. I didn't think much of it at first. Dad was always taking calls for work or from old friends. But as the conversation continued, I began to notice his usual calmness fading away. His responses were short, clipped. He was nodding along to whatever was being said, but I could tell something wasn't right. I tried to catch his eye, but he was focused on the call, his gaze somewhere distant. My curiosity started to grow. Who could be calling him this late on a Saturday? What could be so important that it had this effect on him? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the call ended. My dad sat there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand, as if trying to process whatever had just happened. He let out a long sigh and put the phone down on the table between us. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though I could feel the tension in the air. He hesitated before answering, and when he spoke, it was like the words didn't quite fit. "Yeah, everything's fine." But he didn't look at me when he said it, and there was a heaviness in his voice that didn't make me believe him. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I let it go for the moment. Maybe he was just having one of those days. After all, my dad had always been the strong, silent type, never one to burden others with his problems. But deep down, something told me this was different. The next day, I could barely shake the feeling that something was off. Dad was acting like his usual self, still working in the garage, tinkering with old tools, and doing his best to keep his mind occupied. But I could see the difference now. His movements were more rigid, almost like he was trying to keep something hidden. The phone call from the previous night had clearly shaken him, but what was it about? I didn't want to press him too hard. After all, he was always a private person, and I respected that. But the curiosity was gnawing at me. So after lunch, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search for the number that had called him. It only took a few seconds to find the information. The number was registered to a law firm. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the screen. Why would a law firm be calling my dad? He wasn't involved in any legal matters that I knew of. In fact, he'd never mentioned needing a lawyer. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I knew that I had to ask him about it, even if it meant pushing him out of his comfort zone. So that evening, after dinner, I sat down with him again. "Dad," I began, keeping my voice calm. "Can we talk about something?" He looked up from his plate, giving me a half smile. "Sure, kid. What's on your mind?" I hesitated for a moment before diving in. "You got a call from a law firm last night. What's that about?" His face immediately fell. The smile disappeared, and for the first time in years, I saw him look vulnerable. His eyes shifted around the room, like he was searching for an escape. "It's nothing, son," he said quickly, but I could hear the tremor in his voice. "Just some old business from the past. Nothing you need to worry about." I wasn't buying it. The way he said it, the way he avoided my gaze, it felt like he was hiding something big. I pressed him a little more, but he only grew more distant. Eventually, he excused himself from the table and retreated to his study. That's when I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I had to find out the truth. The next day I woke up earlier than usual. It was a Saturday, but there was no way I could just go on with my day without getting to the bottom of this. Dad was already in the garage, as usual. But instead of starting my day with the normal routine of coffee and small talk, I decided to follow through on my plan. I didn't want to invade his privacy, but the more I thought about the call, the more I felt that something had been hidden from me for far too long. I grabbed my laptop, opened it up, and searched again for that law firm. This time, I focused more on their history and reputation. The deeper I dug, the more questions popped up. It seemed like the firm specialized in estate planning and inheritance disputes. I stared at the screen, a sinking feeling creeping into my chest. Dad had always been someone who worked hard for everything he had, and I knew he didn't have many assets to worry about, but inheritance disputes, that sounded more serious. I decided it was time to confront him again. No more beating around the bush. I had to ask him outright. When I walked into the garage, he was busy cleaning his tools, his back turned to me. I could see that his mind wasn't on the task at hand. His hands were moving mechanically, but his mind seemed elsewhere. "Dad," I said softly, not wanting to startle him, "I need you to tell me what's going on. You've been acting strange, and that call last night. I need answers." He stiffened, and for a moment, I thought he might brush me off again. But then he slowly turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he said, his voice low. "There's something I need to tell you, but it's not going to be easy." The words hung in the air like a weight, and I felt my pulse quicken. It was like I was about to step into a part of my dad's life that had been kept hidden for decades. He motioned for me to sit down, and I did, my hands clammy with anticipation. "It's about your mother," he began, and my heart skipped a beat. "There are things I never told you, things I kept from you for a reason." I sat there, my mind racing. Was this about the things I'd heard as a kid, the rumors, the whispers? Or was it something completely different? Dad took a deep breath, his face growing pale as he glanced around the garage like he was checking for someone to overhear. I could see the old man I knew, the one who would brush everything off with a joke or a shrug, wasn't here today. Instead, there was a man who seemed much older, worn down by years of holding secrets. "Your mother, she wasn't exactly who you thought she was," he said slowly. His eyes locked onto mine, and I could see the weight of years of guilt in them. My mind immediately raced to every scenario that had ever crossed my mind. Affairs, financial troubles, secret lives. But the way Dad said it, it didn't feel like any of those. This was something deeper. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I just nodded for him to continue. "I met her when we were both young," he went on. "We were poor, just trying to make ends meet. But there was always this spark between us. We wanted to build a life together. But there was something she kept from me, something big, a secret she carried from before we even met." He paused, rubbing his face as if to gather his thoughts. "Your mother's family was wealthy, very wealthy, but they kept it hidden. They had a whole different life before she met me. They didn't approve of our relationship, and so your mom cut ties with them. But she didn't leave everything behind. She inherited something she never told me about." I sat there in stunned silence. My mother, wealthy, and she'd kept it from me, from us all these years? "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I finally managed to ask. The anger in my voice surprised even me. I had been living in a house, a life, thinking we were just like everyone else, struggling along. But what if all of this had been an act? "Because I didn't want you to know," Dad answered quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want you to grow up thinking we were different. I didn't want you to have any part of the money, or whatever legacy she left behind." He looked down at the floor, clearly wrestling with the burden of his decision. "But now it's too late to keep it from you." I could feel the room close in on me, the air thick with unspoken things. My brain was spinning, trying to comprehend what Dad had just said. What was the inheritance? Why hadn't Mom told me about it? And why was Dad so adamant about keeping it hidden? I needed more answers. I needed to know the truth. But every time I asked him something, he gave me less. Dad was holding something back. I could feel it in my gut, and it was eating away at me. Dad stood up from his workbench, hands on his hips, as if weighing whether he should continue or not. He was visibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, like he was second-guessing himself. It was clear that whatever he was about to say next would be something he regretted, but that wouldn't stop him from saying it. He was carrying the weight of too many years of silence. "There's more," he began, his voice shaky. "Your mom, she made a choice, a decision that I didn't understand at the time, but I see it clearly now. That inheritance, it's not just money, it's tied to her family's legacy, a legacy I was never meant to be a part of. I've kept quiet all these years because, well, I didn't want to drag you into this mess. But now, it's inevitable. I leaned forward, my pulse racing. What mess, Dad? What are you talking about? He paused, glancing down at the floor as if looking for the words. When your mom passed, I didn't just lose my wife. I lost access to something else, something that was rightfully yours. I didn't know how to handle it, and I still don't. There's a whole trust, a foundation set up for you, and you've got no idea. I could feel my stomach tighten. A trust? A foundation? What was all this about? I'd never been told about any of this. Hell, I hadn't even known that my mother had come from money. I could barely make sense of what was happening, but one thing was clear. There was something big hidden in the shadows of my family, something I had to uncover. Why didn't you tell me about this sooner? I asked, my voice strained, trying to keep my emotions in check. I couldn't, Dad replied, shaking his head. I didn't want you to think that everything we had, everything you worked for, was because of that money. I wanted you to earn things on your own, to make your own way, not live in the shadow of her wealth, but now I can see that it's part of who you are. It's your birthright, and you deserve to know. I could feel a wave of anger and confusion crashing inside me. My whole life had been a lie. The very foundation of everything I thought I knew was crumbling beneath me, and all the answers I'd been seeking only seemed to create more questions. What was my mother's family hiding? What did I really deserve from them? And why did Dad choose to keep me in the dark? But there's something else, Dad added, his eyes darkening with concern. The family? They don't want you to know about it. They'll fight you for it. The weight of those words hit me harder than anything else he'd said. Someone was going to stand in my way? My own family? I didn't know if I was ready for what was coming next. My mind was racing. I couldn't make sense of everything Dad had just thrown at me. A trust, a foundation, family secrets, and now threats from my own relatives. It felt like I was living in some twisted soap opera, where every time I thought I had a grip on things, they slipped through my fingers. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You mean to tell me there's money, a legacy, that I have no clue about, and now you're saying they'll fight me for it? Dad nodded gravely, his expression showing years of worry. It's not just about money, son. It's about power. Your mother's family is old money, the kind of wealth that comes with strings attached. There are expectations, obligations, and they're not people who forgive easily. I leaned back, my head spinning. The room felt like it was getting smaller, suffocating me with all the information that had just been dropped on me. Why are you telling me this now? Why not before? Because now's the time, he said quietly. You're old enough to understand, and because I've run out of ways to protect you from them. I wanted to scream, to shout at him for keeping all of this from me. How could he have kept such a monumental secret for so long? But there was no point in getting angry. He was already carrying the burden of this all by himself. You're telling me this, but I still don't understand. What's the catch? I asked, my voice low and steady despite the storm raging inside me. Dad let out a sigh and looked away. The catch is simple. They want control. They want to know that they can pull the strings whenever they want. If you take what's rightfully yours, they'll stop at nothing to make sure you never use it. I shook my head in disbelief. So, what do I do? Just walk away and forget it? He looked at me with a mix of regret and urgency. I wish it were that simple, but no, they won't let you. Not now that they know you're aware of it. You need to make a choice, son. But be careful. If you decide to go after what's yours, you'll have to fight for it. I swallowed hard, trying to digest everything. This was a war I hadn't asked for, but it seemed like I had no choice but to fight. But how could I fight against my own family? What was I supposed to do? I need time to think, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't just jump into this blindly. Dad nodded slowly, understanding. I know, but remember, they won't give you that time. The longer you wait, the harder it will be. I stood up, pacing around the room. Every part of me wanted to just walk away, to escape from all of this, but deep down, I knew I couldn't. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about my future, my mother's legacy, and maybe even my survival. I barely slept that night, my mind a tangled mess of thoughts and emotions. The weight of what my father had told me was too much to bear all at once. I kept replaying everything in my mind, his words, the tone of his voice, the worry etched on his face. It was like I was being forced into a corner, and I had no idea how to get out. I woke up the next morning, exhausted and drained, but I couldn't avoid the truth any longer. I needed answers. I needed to know what my next move should be. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number that had been in my head all night, my lawyer. After a few rings, his gruff voice came through the line. "Hello? Mark, it's me," I said, my voice tight with anxiety. "I need to talk to you. I don't care what it takes. Get to my office now." There was a brief silence on the other end, then, "I'll be there in an hour." I hung up, still reeling from the conversation with my dad. There were too many pieces to this puzzle, and I wasn't sure I could put them all together. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this go. I couldn't. The next hour passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. Work, emails, even the coffee in front of me. All I could think about was how my life had just taken a sharp turn in a direction I never expected. I didn't want to deal with it, but deep down, I knew that if I didn't, everything I had worked for would be at risk. Mark finally walked in, looking as professional as always, though I could tell something was off. He'd been my lawyer for years, and his sharp instincts had always kept me out of trouble. But today his expression was grim. "All right, what's going on?" he asked, sitting down across from me. "You've got that look on your face." "I need you to help me figure out what the hell I'm up against," I said, leaning forward. "My dad just dropped a bombshell on me. He told me about something I never knew existed, a trust, a family foundation. Apparently I've got a stake in all of it, but now they're coming for me." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Coming for you? Who exactly is they?" "Family," I muttered, rubbing my face. "My mom's side. Apparently there's a whole lot of money and power tied up in this foundation. My dad says if I claim it, they'll fight me for it. And not just fight me, they'll destroy me." Mark sat back, processing what I'd said. "This is big. If what you're saying is true, then your family has been hiding a lot from you." "Tell me something I don't know," I said, my voice bitter. "I need your help, Mark. I need to know what I'm dealing with. I need to know what kind of fight I'm getting into." Mark's face softened for a second. "All right, we'll figure this out. But understand, this could get ugly. If you decide to claim what's yours, there's no turning back. You're not just fighting for money. You're fighting for your place in the family. And these people don't back down." I took a deep breath, letting his words sink in. Part of me wanted to back out, to forget this whole thing and pretend it never happened. But another part of me knew I couldn't. I was already in too deep. "Let's get to work then," I said. "I'm not backing down." Mark nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "I'll start digging into this. I'll need some time, but I'll get back to you with whatever I find. Just know, this isn't going to be easy." I nodded, feeling the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. The fight wasn't just for money. It was for my identity, my future, and no matter how hard it would be, I knew I had to see this through. Days passed, and the weight of the situation kept growing heavier. Every minute felt like I was walking a tightrope, one step away from falling into a pit of chaos. I spent most of my time in meetings, phone calls, and paperwork, trying to piece together anything I could about this mysterious trust and the family foundation. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized just how tangled this web was. Mark kept his word. He did his research, digging through old documents, family records, and private files that were, frankly, difficult to get a hold of. It wasn't just about money, it was about control, influence, and legacy. The foundation wasn't just some charitable cause. It was a tool, a weapon used to manipulate and divide. And I was standing in the middle of it all, unsure of which side I was on, or if there even was a side to choose. One night, Mark called me. "I've got something," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of concern. "It's big. We need to talk in person." My heart skipped a beat. What could it be? I couldn't sit around and wait anymore. I had to know. So I told him to meet me at my office first thing in the morning. The next day, Mark came in, his face pale and tense. He didn't sit down immediately. He stood by my desk, looking like he was about to drop a bomb. "I don't even know how to say this, but I found something," he said, running a hand through his hair. "The foundation you're dealing with, it's not just some family business. It's been tied up in shady dealings for years. Offshore accounts, investments in companies that have questionable backgrounds. I'm talking about things that go beyond what you were told." I blinked, processing his words. "Shady dealings? What kind of dealings?" Mark leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I'm talking about illegal transactions, money laundering, influence peddling. The whole thing's been under the radar for decades. And your family? They've been at the center of it." I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about something far more dangerous, something that could ruin me if I got too close. But it also explained why my father had been so worried. He hadn't just been protecting his legacy. He'd been protecting me from a storm that could destroy everything I'd ever built. "You're telling me the foundation is connected to criminal activity?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What does that mean for me?" "It means you've got two options. Mark said, his tone firm. You can walk away, take your share, and leave all of this behind. Or you can go after it, dig deeper, and find out how deep this rabbit hole really goes. I stared at him, my mind racing. The truth was too dangerous to ignore, but could I really afford to expose myself to something like this? The consequences could be catastrophic, not just for me, but for my family too. After a long silence, I finally spoke. I can't walk away. I've already come this far. Mark nodded, his expression serious. All right, but just remember, you're in this now. No turning back. I sat back in my chair, the gravity of the situation settling in. I'd just taken the first step into a world I knew nothing about, a world of deceit, power, and corruption. And as much as I wanted to pretend I was still in control, I realized I was just another pawn in a much larger game.